North Korea's latest provocation coming just days ahead of the U.S. midterm elections. It's a thorny issue for the U.S., and here's why. Pyongyang has carried out a flurry of missile launches this year. In fact, 2022 has seen the highest number of launches since leader Kim Jong-un took power more than a decade ago, setting off worldwide cries of condemnation and worry. Mr. Kim has vowed to increase and never give up his nation's nukes. His weapons program is marching ahead, one that far outstrips efforts by his father and grandfather. And this puts Washington and its East Asian allies in a worse position than before U.S. President Biden took office. The spate of tests provides the answer to Mr. Biden's engagement-only policy toward Pyongyang. It's not working. And on the international stage, efforts to punish Pyongyang have stalled due to pushback from Moscow and Beijing. Experts say there are a few reasons North Korea is accelerating its extraordinary run of missile tests this year. One is due to a U.S. administration in place that has focused on shows of unity with South Korea. Another reason could be to make a statement and grab the attention of a distracted audience of one, President Biden, as the West is focused on the war in Ukraine. But so far, there has been little indication that the Biden administration will or even can pursue the politically dangerous diplomacy needed to solve a problem that has beset U.S. presidents for decades.
And for more, let's speak with Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Scott, let's start with the state of play on the Korean peninsula, including the launches this morning. North Korea has launched more missiles this year than the three previous years combined. What do you put that down to?
Well, I think the summary was a pretty good, succinct description of some of the external factors that have motivated North Korea. But I go back to the Eighth Party Congress and really the checklist in terms of military modernization and missile development that the North Koreans put forward for themselves as objectives that they wanted to pursue over the course of 5 years from January 2021. And they're moving in the direction of trying to achieve that checklist. The problem, of course, is that some of the items on the checklist, especially in terms of longer-term missiles, run directly counter to what the U.S. wants to see and what the international community has allowed in terms of its sanctions prohibitions on such launches. And then I think another factor that we also need to pay attention to that was not mentioned earlier is the inter-Korean dynamic. And in particular, a lot of these short-range tests really have focused on South Korea, and North Korea has mentioned the idea of fielding a tactical nuclear weapon for battlefield use. And that, I think, directly relates to growing tensions and really almost a preemption competition between the two Koreas as the situation grows more tense between the two sides under a conservative South Korean administration.
Scott, we're on the cusp of midterm elections. If there is a strong showing by Republicans, what are the chances of denuclearization talks progressing in the region, given the GOP would likely take a more isolationist approach to foreign affairs?
Well, the really significant development there is that the Biden administration would face divided government, and that is definitely a constraining factor for any administration. You know, having said that, I think that the Biden administration still would have some level of freedom to pursue a foreign policy initiatives if North Korea will respond. But I see the geopolitical factors really as bigger factors shaping the Biden administration's response, and really the growing perception of threat within Washington is a bigger factor than the electoral outcome next week.
And do you think that North Korea would be keeping an eye on midterms and has a preference perhaps to which way it goes?
I actually think that to the extent that North Korea may be thinking about that, they're probably calculating as related to 2024 rather than the midterms. And the primary reason for that would be the hope that maybe even President Trump, somebody who has a direct personal relationship with Kim Jong-un, could come back and lead the relationship in a very different direction.
There doesn't appear to be any interest by the North to really move away from its allies, Russia and China. What does the U.S. need to do to convince Pyongyang that a relationship with Washington is more valuable than that with Moscow and Beijing?
Well, you're absolutely right that the geopolitical context, and in particular the growing confrontation between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and Russia, has created a lot of space for really opportunism on the part of North Korea to pursue its missile development program. The problem really is that the North Koreans, despite persistent outreach from the Biden administration for dialogue, they've spurned all those efforts. And I think that that's primarily because they don't like the agenda. The Biden administration continues to want to talk about denuclearization. The North Koreans want to engage in talks on the basis of the idea that North Korea is a legitimate, responsible nuclear state. And the Biden administration, by proposing denuclearization talks, is dismissing to some degree the North Korean desire to be recognized as a fellow nuclear state with which the U.S. might pursue détente rather than denuclearization.
Now, speaking of North Korea's nuclear ambitions, the Washington Post reported yesterday that North Korea had issued a veiled threat to use nuclear weapons, saying the U.S. and South Korea would pay the most horrible price in history in response to the ongoing large-scale military drills between the U.S. and South Korea. Is that just rhetoric, or do you expect some sort of nuclear test perhaps to happen?
Well, this next week is really going to be, I think, probably the climax, in particular in terms of what we see in terms of military exercises that North Korea is using as a pretext by which to justify a potential nuclear test, and the air drills that are going on, combined air drills between the U.S. and South Korea involving F-35s, I think, are a focal point and a potential pretext for North Korea to take an additional step. If we can get through the next week and get past the midterms, maybe we might see a situation where the environment would ease. But I think that we cannot discount the possibility that North Korea may go through with some kind of test, especially given the signaling they're doing in their own public statements.
All right, we'll leave it there for now, Scott. Thank you very much for your insights this morning. That was Scott A. Snyder, Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S. Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations.